Hello and welcome to another episode of Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I'm Alex Trembath, your host and deputy director here at Breakthrough. So for this episode, I spoke with Jigar Shah, and actually this is the second time in the last few months that I've interviewed Jigar for this podcast. But the effects of the COVID pandemic rendered our original conversation completely out of date before the episode aired, so Jigar generously offered to talk to me again, and that's what you'll hear today. So Jigar, our guest, co-founded Sun Edison, one of the pioneers in the solar and renewable space, and is now president and co-founder of Generate Capital, a clean energy financing company that recently announced a $1 billion fund for what Jigar calls deployment-led innovation. We start the conversation there and quickly take it to the old debate that has been occupying and frustrating both Jigar and myself for over a decade now, the so-called deployment versus innovation debate. I was excited to have Jigar on the show because while we haven't always seen quite eye to eye on questions around clean energy policy, he's always differed from my view in interesting ways, and ways that I think represent the clean tech sector itself. We're also able to talk about the COVID pandemic and the considerable policy possibilities that we are looking at now. I've been looking forward to talking to Jigar for a while, and it was great to finally have him on this show. Jigar Shah, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Great to have you back. I should say I mentioned this in our intro, but you and I had a conversation a few months ago about some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today, about clean energy and deployment policy and innovation and things like that. And that was, just before the onset of the COVID pandemic. And we were planning on releasing the episode, right around the time the pandemic started. And my producers, Talia and Alyssa, and I were talking. And it felt a little irrelevant, or at least, as you later said, a little stale. And I was thinking about reaching out to you and asking you to offer a little bit more of your time and offering to re-record this episode. And then you emailed us and offered to do it yourself. So I want to thank you for coming back again and for making that offer.
Well, no worries. It's, what happens when you've been doing this for 7 years on the Energy Gang.
Right. We've got a real pro with us today, and I appreciate that too. So I do want to get to sort of how the pandemic is affecting clean tech and affecting your industry. But I want to start this conversation where we started the original conversation, which was around an announcement that your company, Generate Capital, made a few months ago now about a new, what you call, deployment-led innovation fund of over $1 billion. So can you tell us about that announcement, and can you tell us what you mean when you talk about deployment-led innovation?
Yeah, I think for a long, a bit of a, canard around this deployment versus innovation piece. And I think all of us, I think are uniformly pro-innovation. So I don't think that's the issue. But I do think that there's been a bit of tension around whether we should deploy before the innovation has reached some sort of scale of cost reduction, right? So people sort of say, well, we shouldn't really deploy solutions until they're more cost effective than what they're replacing. And I think what the solar and wind industry has shown, and increasingly other sectors as well, like LED lighting, is that it actually doesn't, you don't actually get the cost reduction until you've done deployment. And then once you've done deployment, micro innovations that in the solar's case makes the efficiency slightly better and the throughput of the manufacturing facility slightly faster and all of that stuff, helps to keep the learning curve robust and costs coming down every year. And I think that in general, that approach to getting clean energy solutions out into the marketplace, including for things like nuclear or geothermal, et cetera, has been, I don't think has been in the forefront of conversation, but it is the reason our money has been raised. And it's the reason why a lot of people have supported us, is that we've been on the vanguard of these technologies that have frankly been under deployed and deploying them faster to get more cost reduction.
Yeah, one of the things I like to point out is that the production tax credit for wind has been around since I think 1992. The investment tax credit for renewable energy that most principally benefits solar has been around since I think 2005, which is at least several years before solar really started to be noticeable in state level or U.S. Electricity generation portfolios. And so the deployment policies that I think we're going to talk a little bit more about, they exist and they have impact before these technologies are making sort of a more than non-trivial impact on markets. And that doesn't mean that those technologies are not ready. It might mean that those deployment policies need more time to help creating these nascent markets and help driving those initial cost reductions.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would say is, as someone who's been on the front lines of putting a lot of that policy in place for solar, the other thing that is required is to make it super lucrative. When you think about how much money, for instance, people are making on the low carbon fuel standard credits in California, um, it's necessary for that much money to be made to create the buzz and the enthusiasm necessary to bring not just one investor, but many investors into the space so that you actually have a healthy level of competition on that side as margins get tighter and volumes get larger.
Another side of this is what happens later in the deployment cycle. I think maybe I don't know if it's unpopular or counterintuitive, but an argument that I've seen you make is that especially in recent years, these deployment policies, maybe the federal ITC and PTC, the federal tax credits in particular, I've seen you suggest should be actually phased out, despite the fact that I think the solar and wind lobbies still do lobby for extensions of those credits, and a lot of the environmental community still thinks that we need to be putting a big federal push behind deployment policy. So, as a champion of deployment of technology in general, and not just policy driven, but as a champion of deployment in general, why do you say that those credits should be phased out, or why have you said that?
Well, in general, you can see obviously through this current crisis that we're in that people would have loved to have a feed-in tariff or something that looked more like cash instead of tax credits, given that fewer people are paying taxes right now. So I think that's one piece of it. But the other piece of it is that there's a fixed amount of tax equity in the United States that's actively investing in these types of credits. So that number used to be 7 to 9 billion. I think it's been expanded through a lot of marketing efforts to corporations. So now maybe it's up to 10 or 12 billion. But in general, that number is not going to be 50 billion. So if you're going to extend them to carbon sequestration and storage, if you're going to extend them to fuel cells and geothermal and anaerobic digesters and other things, like, you could imagine that the people that are in the tax credit buying position are really not incentivized to help all these other orphan technologies. They're really focused on doing more solar and wind because that's the path of least resistance. And so once you reach that level of scale, my sense is that the federal government can start to phase that down, which is what we got in the 2015 extension that we passed. And you can move the incentives for solar and wind to the state level, right? You already have 100% clean energy standards. So people have to buy the power regardless. It's just part of the standards. And so maybe people, the utilities pay an extra penny a kilowatt hour for the power. I think that that's the right way to support those technologies. And, you leave the rest of the tax credit capacity for some of these orphaned tax credits for new technologies that need to be scaled up.
And is that all that's missing? Is it that tax equity markets are directing most of their heft towards solar and wind projects right now, and that if, say, sort of utility scale solar and wind projects were not eligible for an ITC or a PTC, it would naturally flow to other eligible projects. Some of which are already eligible. I think that small hydro and geothermal and bioenergy can qualify for some of these federal tax credits. If carbon sequestration or small nuclear were eligible, is that the missing piece, or do these technologies and markets need something else?
Well, they certainly need a lot more than the tax credits, right? But I think we are just focused on the tax credits for this conversation. I think, as you pointed out with the wind PTC, that's been around since 1992, and the wind industry really didn't take off until the 2000s. So I think that we're doing a lot, for instance, just to generate capital around figuring out how to promote these technologies, and that includes, some participation in regulatory affairs. It includes education of industry leaders, right, in areas of like organic waste, for instance. We attend conferences where they talk about the circular economy, and producers of food waste, talk about what their plans are to shift food waste away from landfills to other places to put it, right? So there's a broad level of engagement that we have to be involved in to help the ecosystem get to the point of scale. But the tax credit piece of it, part of it is actually just having the solar and wind folks not crowd out the rest.
You mentioned that that through, I think you said, various sort of marketing efforts, that tax equity itself has been expanded in recent years. So how do you think, uh, as a developer, as an investor, about expanding the commercial opportunity for clean tech projects? How do you get more corporates? How do you get more funds? How do you get more investors in this space and open up the pool of capital?
Well, I think that in the end, what we're really talking about here is infrastructure, right? And depending on how you define infrastructure, the world actually deploys between 5 and $10 trillion of infrastructure every year. So the question really to me is not about clean energy as much as it's about how do we actually tap into those funds and figure out how to shift those funds um, to make sure that all of the things that they invest in are into the climate friendly version of what they would have installed. And so our investors, right, that have been publicly announced in this last round of capital include, Queensland Investment Corp and Australian Super and AP2. These are big investors who are already three of the world's largest infrastructure investors, and getting them to look at what we're doing as part of their infrastructure allocation was a Herculean feat, but I think it's the next stage of what we need to do. And as they get more comfortable with what we're doing and not just, doing ports and airports and parking meters and toll roads, you start to see a much broader set of capital providers and the experts who allocate them, getting into our space and getting more comfortable. And then the question becomes, what does the public sector do to attract that capital? Right today, I think they're all pretty obsessed with using municipal bonds and some of those kinds of techniques to raise infrastructure capital. But you can imagine in the future that it's not just the cost of capital that they're worried about. It's also making sure that this infrastructure is maintained properly and is providing the services that they rightfully paid for. Right. So, because if they use municipal bond financing to pay for an automated recycling plant, for instance, and then the recycling plant isn't working, well, then the city has to put more money into fixing it. Whereas if it's a private company that bought it and put it up, then you could actually make the payments tied to the facility working. And if the facility doesn't work, then they don't get paid.
Just to give our listeners a little context, I think when you and I first started having conversations about this stuff, typical solar power purchase agreement was probably in the like 15 cent range, maybe, the sort of the 10 to 20 cent range about a decade ago. And now we're seeing PPAs in closer to like the 2 to 3, and even sometimes like down to the 1 cent per kilowatt hour range. Another maybe unpopular, maybe counterintuitive argument that I think I've seen you put out is that there is such a thing as too cheap for some of these PPAs. That some of these PPAs and some of these prices for solar projects are too low. So is that an accurate representation of your views? And if so, what do you mean by too cheap?
Yeah, well, it certainly is an accurate representation of my view. I think that in general, when you think about the gold standard here, is General Electric and Siemens putting out their natural gas turbines and actually making more money on the service and maintenance of those turbines than they did on selling the turbines originally, right? And because of that, GE and Siemens were very much incentivized to make sure those turbines were always well maintained and were always available to the electricity grid. I think that in general, we've been forced by, popular culture, by, sort of weird dynamics to try to break barriers and get the cheapest possible cost per kilowatt hour, as opposed to saying, what would incentivize all of the players within our ecosystem to make sure that these units are operating at peak performance all the time. And for a long time, I think we just assumed that we had solved that problem because we were signing contracts with sophisticated institutional capital providers. And clearly, those debt providers and equity providers wouldn't get paid back if the projects fell into disrepair. But what we're finding is that in fact the maintenance providers are acting irrationally to offer lower and lower prices to gain more market share, and that in general we're all pretty afraid that the music might stop and they might actually just end up going bankrupt, and then you're stuck having to pay higher prices anyway. I think the other part of my comment was really around features, right? For a long time, solar and wind were a small percentage of the overall mix. And so we were just, feeding directly into the grid, and people said, oh, you need to be backed up by natural gas. But ultimately, we were such a small part of the mix that the backup power didn't really matter. Even now, solar is only about 4% of the US grid, and I think wind is double that. And so they're not really that significant. But going forward, you're seeing that pretty much all new solar and wind projects are adding battery storage, for instance, to their systems, which of course make them a little bit more expensive, but also give them the ability to provide more flexible dispatch and to have more features that the grid is willing to pay for, right? And I think that's where the solar and wind industry needs to go, as opposed to trying to figure out lowest possible cost per kilowatt hour.
You mentioned that we are all pro innovation here, and I think it's hard to find people who would self-identify literally as anti-innovation. And I think that both of us, in different ways, have been frustrated with deployment versus innovation, or the R&D versus deployment debates over the years. So I just wanted to ask you, what about that have you found frustrating or limiting, and what do you think people get wrong when they talk about deployment and innovation?
Well, remember that the deployment versus innovation battle is not ours, right? This is the realm of presidents and prime ministers, right? For decades, presidents and prime ministers were basically satiating folks who really wanted progress through innovation, right? When Bill Clinton, for instance, got elected in 1992 to become president, we had just exited the Gulf War and oil prices had spiked, and he promised to raise CAFE standards, which were the fuel economy standards for cars. And he bailed as soon as he got in office and said, we're going to start the Partnership for a New Generation of Vehicles, which was an R&D and innovation program. And I have nothing wrong with the Partnership for a New Generation of Vehicles. I, in fact, worked on that program when I was a contractor at Energetics. But we really did hurt millions of people who suffered from asthma and other illnesses because we didn't force higher CAFE standards, right? And I think that we all need to acknowledge that deployment policy and innovation policy are not as related as everybody wants them to be. That in fact, deployment-led innovation says that you have to start deploying, and then the automakers will find better ways of reaching those targets, cheaper ways of reaching those targets than their initial ideas. But if you actually just give them a pass and say, just do the innovation, and then when you get cheap enough, then we can deploy, then you never, ever actually hit the goal.
Yeah, this is something that we try and pay pretty close attention to at Breakthrough. Obviously we were strongly in favor in the mid-late 2000s of both big R&D and deployment pushes for things like batteries, wind, and solar, and remain in favor of those policies in general. Obviously, a big technological focus of ours has been next generation small advanced nuclear reactors, which is one of the reasons I asked that question about tax equity markets. I think that some type of tax credit for advanced nuclear would make sense, but it's not like if you created one in some sort of COVID stimulus bill next month, then a bunch of these reactors would be deployed because they don't really exist yet. Which I think gets to your point about how some of the R&D, the demonstration of the deployment policies, while they might need to be sequenced or linked in a certain way, are quite different and do different things.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and I've obviously talked with folks at Oklo and NewScale and others. And, I am a huge fan of what they're doing, but that's part of what I've, argued with them about is I've said, I know that you actually just want to consider yourself part of the power sector, but I mean, you just have a lot of characteristics that are not the same. And so part of what you should be doing is just mandating that you get $100 million set aside for yourself in the next Defense Appropriations Act. And you should start putting 1.5 megawatt and 50 megawatt facilities at military bases. And so I think sometimes they think, oh, well, that doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense. We really want to be a private sector enterprise. But that's how the game is played. And I think that, while I'm fully supportive of the nuclear industry getting access to the same tax credits that the solar and wind industry benefit from, I don't know that that's actually the right way to commercialize it in the United States. My sense is that you'd actually just want to have as a goal that you put a nuclear plant on every military base.
Yeah, I don't have a particularly strong view on that question. I don't know if they need to be mutually exclusive, but that is how a lot of promising new technologies start, either through military procurement or demonstration by the U.S. government, often the military, and that's true outside of energy technologies. That was true for GPS and semiconductors, where the first and for years only customer for a lot of technologies that are now literally all around us was the U.S. military. Sort of more broadly, I agree that we might see a sort of similar trajectory in the long term for advanced reactors as we do for solar and wind, but the early markets might look quite different than existing markets for solar and wind. Whether those are military bases or whether those are demonstration projects at national labs, and it's important to think about where these technologies are in the sort of innovation to deployment life cycle. That is a really difficult question and very sort of technology specific one.
Yeah, well, I mean, they certainly are. It is a very difficult question and technology specific, but I think that ultimately it goes to who are the right constituents for these conversations, and how does one work with those constituencies to make this happen, right? So whether you're talking about soil carbon and trying to figure out how to do that through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or whether you're talking about industrial efficiency or heat or electric vehicles or all these other things, there are clear and easier pathways to achieving deployment. And I do feel like we at times get intellectually lazy about how we work through this sector by sector, just because I don't think it's the realm of the policymakers or the lobbyists that we pay to push the policymakers to solve this problem, because many of them don't actually have the expertise, right? They need to get their marching orders from the developers. And developers, I would say in general, are not differentiated from the technology providers in our sectors, right? So, technology providers, right, the people who invent new approaches or better approaches, are largely not good developers. And you see that consistently in many areas. The developer partners are usually external to the technology providers, and they're the ones who say, should I spend time on a greenfield plant? Should I spend time buying up an old coal plant and retrofitting it into this other technology, right? And those nuances are generally the expertise of developers, who then don't share their expertise, in a good way with policymakers and, the lobbyists that serve them.
I do want to ask you about this new reality that we're all living in. So obviously, clean tech, clean energy is not customer service, it's not retail, it's not restaurants, but we are facing down a possible years-long economic downturn that will have impacts on capital mobilization, will have impacts on electricity demand. From your vantage point, what are the prospects? What are the threats to clean tech and clean energy faced by COVID, maybe in the immediate term and in the long term?
Well, I mean, there certainly are a lot of threats, but my sense is that the downturn is actually so large and so acute that there are very few simple answers to fossil fuels. Right? Remember, the way fossil fuels works is that they have an enormous amount of infrastructure. And that infrastructure is really paid on a utilization basis. And so if people are not fully utilizing that infrastructure, then the costs of each incremental gallon goes way up, right? So for instance, if a refinery is run at a 50% of capacity perspective, then instead of adding, pick a number randomly, 30 cents a gallon to the cost of gasoline, it now needs to add 60 cents a gallon to the cost of gasoline just to get back to where it was before in terms of making enough money to pay for itself, right? And so if you have permanently less capacity being sold to the general public, right? So you go from 100 million barrels a day to, today 85 million barrels a day, let's say, then it's not enough to just say we've got to figure out how to subsidize this group, that group, or the other group. You actually have to shut in capacity, right? And so everyone talks all the time about shutting in capacity for drilling rigs, but they don't really talking about shutting in to capacity of pipelines or of Halliburton rigs or of refinery capacity or gas stations for that matter, right? If everyone across the country at gas stations sells 15% less gas, they're all going bankrupt, right? Like they actually need some of them to go under. And and so it's they're actually in a pretty existential crisis. And I think that some humanity on our part is needed. I think that the constant sort of bashing of the fossil fuel industry is probably not a great look or even good for all those extraordinary people who work in that industry who have specialty skills that can be used for decarbonization. So, I mean, I think to answer your question, I don't see a lot of ways for clean energy to get negatively impacted by COVID. My sense is that we're actually going to get supercharged by COVID on the other side. But I think that to actually get to the level of supercharging required to meet anywhere near what climate change requires, I think does require us to find a way to be inclusive of the 3.6 million people in the US at least that are working, in and around the oil and gas industry. Otherwise, we end up in the same trajectory that we're at now, which is impressive, but wholly insufficient.
I've had a similar reaction in the last couple of weeks, actually, having seen quite a few arguments that, look, fossil fuels are causing climate change. They're an industry in decline. They are run by these corrupt oil barons. We should just let these industries die, or at least not bail them out. And I certainly have a hard time going full tilt in that direction, not least because there are millions of workers in these industries, not to mention, as you say, quite technically skilled workers who could be working on pipelines for zero carbon fuels or for CO2 or things like that, or drilling for geothermal in the long run. I also worry about the politics of it, that when we're bailing out every industry we can, do the environmental and clean energy communities want to be making sort of a full-throated case to let this one fairly important industry die? As someone who hopes that we shift off of fossil fuels aggressively over the next couple of decades, they still power 75+% of U.S. energy consumption. So it seems that both technically and politically not bailing them out or letting them die is not a fully tenable position to me.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Although I would say it slightly differently, which is that I definitely think that most of the U.S. oil industry will die. I mean, I just don't. I mean, they were already zombie corporations starting in 2015, right? If you look at the shale oil industry, none of them have made free cash flow, really, as sort of an industry sector since they got started. So they were already sort of being subsidized by cheap credit by the Federal Reserve. And so to me, I don't see how they survive this. And I do think Saudi Arabia and Russia will come out ahead here by, seeing a significantly weaker shale industry after this. But I think it's really about the transition and making sure that we're fully funding and maybe even, highly lucratively funding the transition of this industry into all those other areas you were talking about, whether it's geothermal or carbon capture and sequestration or other things. I don't disagree with you that oil is an important commodity around the world. But remember, the reason why we have a modern society today is because the energy return on energy invested has been so high for oil. That's not true for shale or for oil sands or Arctic or even for deep sea drilling, right? A lot of the energy return on energy invested falls way below 10, meaning you get less than 10 units of energy that you can use for other purposes for every 1 unit of energy that you invest in those. And when you look at solar and wind and other things, the energy invested there returned is in the 20 to 30 to 40 range. And so my sense is that we are on a slow decline of oil, and it is in our best interest to make sure the transition occurs faster. For lots of reasons, right? Put yourself in the position of a governor, right, in California. The amount of money you're saving right now with lower oil prices is gargantuan, right? And the amount of money that's going into the pockets of the people of the state of California, residential consumers, is gargantuan. And so you want that to continue to happen. You don't want what China is going through now, where they're back to pre-COVID traffic levels in China and burning, the oil again. You want really heavy policy that basically bans probably internal combustion engines in many of these localities where that's politically possible to do so. Because if you can destroy just 1 million barrels a day every year reliably, you could keep oil prices down below, $30-$40 a barrel.
Well, speaking of such things, the last thing I want to ask you probably depends quite a bit on what happens in the November election. But as you're surveying the terrain, what types of policy responses relevant to clean energy, deployment, innovation, whatever, climate, do you think are likely and do you think are possible?
Well, I mean, I think that the world is our oyster today. So I think everything is possible and everything is likely. My sense is that when you think about how bad this is, I think in most cases, I would say the vast majority of Republicans that I've talked to, recently still have not fully grasped how bad this is going to be, right? So as we're taping today, the U.S. Department of Commerce came out and said that unemployment in the United States is 14.7%, which is far higher than it was during the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And so we're now entering Great Depression level unemployment. My sense is that number is going to continue to go up, not down, even with the Paycheck Protection Program. And so if you believe that we're heading into a second Great Depression, and now you say we really need to create make-work programs, right? That's what we did in the Great Depression to get through it, right? We didn't actually solve the Great Depression until World War II hit, and we had the ramp up to World War II. But in the intervening years of the Great Depression, we basically created make-work programs with the Work Progress Administration. And so I think that's what we're going to have to do here, right? I mean, could you imagine paying everybody $2,000 a month to sit at home, which is what some congressional leaders are pushing? My sense is if you're going to pay them $2,000 a month, you're going to make them do something. And there's lots of things to do, right? I mean, just pre-COVID, we announced a 1 trillion tree initiative, right, with Mark Benioff and President Trump. Well, we could be planting 1 trillion trees, right? We could be fixing a lot of ecosystem services. We have a huge amount of sea level rise coming, and there's a lot of work to be done in that area. There's a lot of weatherization to be done, right? We probably have 12 million additional homes that we've identified from the era stimulus bill time of 2009 when we increased weatherization budgets back then that we never got to. Well, we could finish weatherizing all those homes, right? And remember, during the polar vortex 2 years ago or 3 years ago, there were people in the Midwest that couldn't get their houses above 55 degrees, right? I mean, there's lots of things that you could do that would have huge political support. And the same thing's true with electric vehicles. The amount of people that are dying from COVID are being more than offset by the amount of people who are being saved right now from lower levels of air pollution. You could imagine there's actually a tremendous amount of political support for keeping that air pollution low. And that's a lot of stimulus that's required to do that. So I think as things get bad, you're going to see an enormous opportunity to do change at scale that we thought was previously unfathomable.